Well, welcome everybody today to the Top 10 Fraud Risks in the Oracle E-Business Suite webinar. My name is Jeffrey Hare. I am the CEO and the founder of ERP Risk Advisors. I'm happy to be participating in today's webinar with Stephen Kost, the Chief Technology Officer from Intergrigy. This is a great new opportunity for both Stephen and I. We've known each other for a long time, have exchanged a lot of information over the years and helped each other out, and have, I think, a great mutual respect. But this is our first webinar we've done together, our first webinar in quite a while, and it hopefully is a very timely topic for organizations running E-Business Suite. So we've got a pretty decent crowd today, a lot of slides to get through. We had a lot of questions submitted, and we figured there's going to be quite a bit of Q&A during the towards the end of the presentation, so we're going to hop right into things. And I just would design related to fraud below the materiality level, sometimes specifically because the way that controls and processes are designed to meet SOX compliance. This is a topic that I've been well published on a variety of different venues, including the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. So what we're going to look at today is specifically fraud risk within the material pay process. The first couple of slides just identified a couple of different fraud risks. There's a lot of different fraud risks, and I'm hoping actually to write a book on the topic in the few months, in the coming months, because there is, I think, a lack of awareness of the risks related to fraud, and then the related controls that should be in place to prevent and detect those type of risks. So I'm just going to talk through a few of these, and then we're going to focus on a couple specific ones today. How we kind of organize this webinar is we're going to talk through a couple of risks in particular, and in a variety of different ways those risks can be exploited. So it's both the theoretical concept of how fraud can be committed, and then both Stephen and I will talk through ways that those are exploited for a variety of different methods. So here's some samples of fraud risks. These aren't necessarily in any order of what are the most important ones or the highest levels of risks. In lots of cases, assessment of risk involves understanding your environment, your processes, and your controls to really understand and evaluate the level of risk in your organization. So the first one, ACH file was altered after it is generated from the AP system. ACH file, for those of you that are familiar with it, would be a file that would be generated from E-Business Suite that would get transmitted to the bank, usually upon a secure FTP connection or something along those lines. And then based upon that file being sent from your organization, those payments would be made at the bank level electronically. So there is some level of risk even after the file is generated that it could be tampered with. The second risk, fictitious vendor created in the system. These are the two things I've italicized, the next two, because we're going to talk specifically about these. I always call the fictitious vendor creating the system, it's the gateway to fraud. There's a lot of different ways that fraud can be committed in your organization once a fictitious vendor is established in the system. So that's one of the key risks we're going to talk about today. The second one would be fictitious bank account. It's set up either for a fictitious vendor or for a valid vendor that is being paid via ACH. So those are the two we're going to key in on, and I'll talk through the rest of this list. Check stock is user generated check that is not recorded in the AP system. So control would be maintenance or security over check stock. In EBS, there's specifically an ability, the next one down here, to change an address on the check while the check is being generated. That would allow a user to redetermine or change the determination of where that check is being mailed. And then through a variety of different means, they can take that check once they have a physical check associated with it, cash it, redevelop that check with a different name, and circumvent potentially your positive pay file. Check voided in the AP system. Often voided checks, once they're done, go through different processes, different levels of scrutiny. So a check that would be voided in the AP system after it's generated would be one way that fraud could be potentially tried to be covered up. And oftentimes those things are caught during the bank reconciliation process if they're done in a timely manner. Invoice approvers, the approver for the invoices, their signature is falsified. So a lot of you have, like a signature list for department managers, and one risk would be potentially like somebody in the AP department or purchasing department having access to that list or falsifying a signature, indicating approval on an invoice. Invoice distribution coded to the wrong account. That's one where somebody may be trying to manipulate the system and putting a fictitious invoice or a payment to an account that often doesn't get the same level of scrutiny. For example, it goes to a sales account or an expense account that has a very large dollar amount or large budget that the actual analysis or flux analysis wouldn't catch. And then the last one is just a data entry for an AP clerk, falsifying either supplier, master, bank account, invoice information with their valid access to the system. So those are some examples of risks, and I'm going to talk through specifically a couple of the ones we talked about, like supplier, master, maintenance. And this, what I really want to focus on is what are some ways that fraud can be committed once a fictitious supplier is established in the system. And here's just 5 ways that once that supplier is set up that fraud can be committed. The first one would be a purchase order with a two-way match. So it could be a buyer that it generates a PO. They choose an account that maybe isn't often scrutinized or heavily scrutinized to code that account to. They use a two-way match in the PO, so there's no receipt requested or receipt required for that invoice to be paid. They could generate an invoice outside the system, mail that invoice to your AP lockbox or your AP PO box, and reference that PO once the PO would be matched to the or the invoice would be matched to the PO. Since it's a two-way match, that PO would automatically be ready to be paid. It go through the normal, evaluation process and such. So that's a very high-risk process, having a two-way match with a fictitious vendor. The next one would be invoices approved with an approval limit. So if the supplier was set up, a fictitious supplier was set up, an invoice could be approved by like a department manager up to their approval limit, depending upon your controls related to whether there's one signature required, 2 signatures required, or who has to sign invoices or approvals for invoices. So that would be a fairly simple scheme. Is to once they have a fictitious vendor set up, they've got an approval limit, let's say $500. They can code that to generally they're restricted on coding that to things departmental expenses or expenses within the cost center. But often those people are the same people that are also doing budgeting. Those that have approval for invoices could budget amounts that are able to be cover up fraud in this type of scenario. Invoice with a falsified signature, I alluded to that earlier. So it could be somebody else that's established a fictitious vendor, and instead of having an approval limit, they falsify the signature for somebody else that has an approval limit and send that through company mail or what have you. A three-way match with auto receipt, so a drop ship type scenario, in essence becomes like a two-way match because the auto or the receipt process happens automatically because it's assumed that transaction happens automatically via drop ship. So it's almost like I said, it's the same level of risk as the two-way match we discussed earlier. And then invoice data entered without supporting invoice. So this would be where an AP clerk may be in collusion or may have set up a fictitious vendor themselves and not having any data or paper to enter. They're just entering data without any supporting invoice. So those are some types of risks. You may say, well, we have the controls in place that would cover, a variety of those risks. May or may not be, again, without going through an extensive review and analysis of what your controls are, how often your controls are performed, who performs the controls, segregation of duties between, data entry and auditing. It's difficult to comment on how applicable it would be to your environment. So supplier master maintenance would be one. So the point really being here, there's a variety of different ways. Just give you 5 examples here to commit fraud once a fictitious supplier is established in your vendor master, and so therefore the vendor, I would say the vendor approval and validation process is very critical, and the ability to set up a fictitious vendor in a variety of different ways, whether it's through back-end access or through normal means, very critical process and control. So similar to this, bank account maintenance, it's the same thing if you have an ACH vendor, and having the ability to set up a bank account and associate that with, in an 11i environment, you can associate one bank account to multiple suppliers. It's set up through, the AP bank accounts, all tables, versus in R12, you're setting up a supplier at directly at this, or a bank directly at the supplier level. And then really the ability to commit fraud really comes down to setting a bank account up during the payment cycle. Maybe you could set it up permanently or change it temporarily during a payment cycle, and then that bank account then gets sent to the bank as part of the ACH process and fraudulently paid. So bank account maintenance is another thing we'll talk about. A lot of companies, again, have very tight controls on bank account maintenance because of the risk associated with this. And as a whole, I'm going to talk about policies and procedures because it's obviously critical to establish policies and then appropriate procedures related to that. So some examples of policies that relate to security fraud, prevention, detection are a couple on these next couple of slides. So the first one would be all new suppliers and changes to suppliers should have some level of validation, i.e., depending upon what you determine is the level of risk and how much, cost-benefit analysis you want to do in terms of what level of risk you take versus, slowing down the process or level of effort you're willing to put into preventing or monitoring the creation of fictitious vendors. So here's a couple of examples that organizations have done. I always recommend getting an I-9 on the front end before a vendor is set up. It's critical that you have that. A lot of organizations will say we'll get it at some point in the future, and there's a variety of different risks about having the I-9. The IRS EIN or TIN verification process is sometimes used. Sometimes a D&B search, looking at website, third-party verification. Hey, I know this company, I've done business with them elsewhere would be an example. And then validation of data entry would be another important concept of once the data is entered. So these are just a variety of different mechanisms. You can have a 2-tier system where you have, some level of risk you're willing to take, and then once you, invoices go above a certain dollar amount, then you do a secondary type of review. So there's, again, it's how you design the process really is very unique to your company. Similarly, policy for bank accounts, all the bank accounts and changes to bank accounts should be verified, should go through secure facts, you should do a callback related to verify the facts information. There's some validation, data entry, independent of the person doing that. So that would be an example of a policy that would be related to the risk of bank accounts and changes. A couple other policies here: verification of the ACH files to make sure that the ACH files weren't manipulated before, during, or after the transmission process. Identify protocol for wires, how you can handle wires, who's responsible for calling callbacks, how many people are going to be called back, whether it's random or specific. Use of deposit pay for all checks, the approval authorities established by the board, and then how you're handling the audit process for bank and supplier ads. And I would say before, should be audited 100% of changes before payments are made as a preventative control. So the next thing we're going to talk about is some of the application controls that are specific to Oracle that either help or hurt procure to pay fraud. Those that are automated by configuration, a couple of examples would be allow address change. That's that payables option setup that allows somebody to change the address during manual check payment, so a one-off payment during the creation of that payment. PO line types determine by default whether it's a two-way match or a three-way match. And then also note that I've got this. I'll hold my comment there. PO document types would be if you've got controls related to PO approvals or requisition approvals. The approval, whether or not something goes through a workflow approval and how that approval is done, would be through PO document types. Another example would be the use of approvals management, the AME module, where you've got a custom approval process built in use. So the manual application controls would be things that are set by policy, things like not allowing suppliers or bank accounts to be set up without approved paperwork, or by policy, you may suggest that buyers are not allowed to override the matching requirements when entering a PO at the shipment level. So that's one of the kind of the flaws, if you will, or features of the purchase order process is even if you have line types set up to, let's say all line types are set up to have a three-way match, you can override that at the shipment level to allow for a two-way match. And obviously we talked about some of the risks associated with that. So that's kind of my general commentary. I'm going to transition into general IT risk and controls. This is definitely an area where Steve and I have a lot to talk about during this presentation. So I'll talk about these general IT controls, and then I'm going to transition to Steve here in a second. So just be aware of the general IT controls that can allow data to be updated outside of policy. So this is would be the ability to change the data either through direct database access or a variety of different mechanisms. So I'll just talk through here. Obviously, the vulnerability of direct database updates, most organizations think they have that relatively tightly controlled because they have, like the apps account locked down. It's secured with the DBAs or the apps DBAs to only, allow for those changes through the app's login through a certain process that's very well defined and very tightly controlled. I know Steven's going to have a lot of comments on that. Use of SQL forms. There's a variety of SQL forms that allow ad hoc SQL statements to be executed without necessarily needing a secondary or a database login, independent of just using the application. I know Steven's going to talk through some examples of that. Use of seeded or vendor-supplied accounts at application database level. Those that may have specific permissions or may have permissions that are allowed to exploit certain vulnerabilities, either at the application level or the database level. Resetting of passwords, obviously very critical. If somebody can get control of a critical app account or a database account and take over somebody else's login. And then the last one is it's the use of shared logins, which generally aren't recommended, but some organizations have used those for a variety of different reasons. And then this is the transition slide. I'm going to talk through this, the IT security components, and then hand the presentation off to Steve. So I would say, in general, there's a lot of what I would call IT security. So those are the things that I generally define as things that happen below the application level. So OS activity, database activity, server activity, and there's a lot of back-end access that allows somebody to backdoor having access to the database. So it's critical to have a well-defined variety of different policies and procedures related to those accesses. And Steven's going to go into that in a lot more detail here. Adhere to the Oracle best practices document, the MetaLake documents noted here, 189.367.1 is for 11i, the 403.537.1 is for R12. I have been involved with a lot of clients that either were not aware of those documents being out there or haven't documented compliance on an initial basis or documented compliance on an ongoing basis with the recommendations. A little call out to Stephen here and his firm, Intergrigy. If you look at the copyright documents at the top, a lot of this document was written by Intergrigy and it's being used by Oracle. But Oracle generally, I would say, as it relates to these documents, is, well, they haven't updated them. It's not generally, they haven't updated these documents. A lot of even the R12 documents a couple years old. So I would say these are minimums, but they certainly are not comprehensive in any way. And the fact that these quote-unquote best practices documents have not been maintained by Oracle is an indicator to me as a security professional that Oracle really doesn't have a very strong focus on best practices for security. And so, as a selfish perspective, I mean, that's why you use companies like ERP Risk Advisors and Intergrigy to do independent design and audit of security. And then performing periodic security reviews and assessments, validating the compliance and security best practices. The definition or the defining of those best practices in your policies and procedures is not a one-time thing. It's not one and done. There are risks on an ongoing basis as patches are being introduced, as changes are happening with the application, that those things can become out of compliance for a variety of different reasons, and which is why it's so important to have an ongoing assessment process. So that's kind of my spiel for the first part of the presentation. I'm going to hand off the rest of the presentation to Stephen, and then we're going to be back. I'll be back towards the end of the presentation to have some final conclusions and do Q&A.
Thanks, Jeff.
And over to you. Yep.
So that's a good overview. I'm actually going to change presenters real quick here because I updated some of the slides in the last couple minutes based on some of the input that people had from the questions that you were submitting when you did the registration. So again, thank you very much for all those questions everyone submitted, which helped us dramatically change the presentation to make it more specific to what you were looking for. So give me 1 second here as I change over. So as Jeff talked about IT security from a general perspective, and also went very in depth into the application controls, what I'm going to talk about now is more about IT security and how we really blow the application controls out of the water by going to the back end and actually circumventing any controls you might have in place by doing direct database updates and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about passwords and other things. So when we talk about Oracle E-Business Suite, the passwords are actually stored in the database for when users enter information. And those are actually stored encrypted by default, not hashed. And so anyone who's in the IT security world will understand the difference between encryption and hashed, but being probably internal auditors on this call, what's happening is Oracle's encrypting the password so it can actually reuse it later on, which isn't really needed by the application. And so it should be stored hashed. And so encrypted means I can get back the password. Hashed means it's stored and it's unreversible. So Oracle's storing the passwords in the FND user table. And there's a flaw in that you can actually very easily decrypt those passwords if you can get into the FND user table. And so if you just go out and Google Oracle application password decryption, you can actually find all this information and how to decrypt these passwords fairly easily. Oracle actually did a fix for this and actually allowed you to then hash the passwords. This is optional though. One of the major issues is that most people are not implementing the hashing, and it's not even included in R12 by default. You actually have to enable it. Intergrigy's got a very good white paper on our website that actually goes through and details this out. Probably more than you ever wanted to know, but it's all there. So why is this actually such a significant issue? So when we go through, what will happen is if there's some user that actually has access to the FND user table, and raise your hands on who's got the apps read account or some similar account that actually has read access to the database. A lot of IT support people have that, maybe some of your super users, probably a lot of developers, and usually there's not a lot of controls around that account. So what happens is people can get into the FND user table. The passwords are encrypted, but what happens then is that data is actually copied down to production, test, and development environments. So you're cloning your production on a periodic basis to both test and development. and those passwords almost always are never changed. So an end user's password in production is the same end user password in test and development. Very few organizations actually change those. So now what can happen is someone, even in a development environment, can go in to your development, access the FND user table, a simple Google out on the internet for Oracle Applications Password Decryption, and they'll actually get a very detailed procedure. And all you need is to run a little bit of SQL. It's all well documented out. And then you can get the app's password. So if not getting the app's password is bad enough, you can't get the app's password in production from development, but I can now get it in development. And then I can just run another SQL statement, and I can actually get all application end user passwords. So the key there is application end users passwords in production, because you didn't change them when you copied production to development. So now, with a fairly simple procedure, I can actually log into production as any user as I want because I know their passwords. So the key here is, well, if I want to do that procure-to-pay fraud, maybe setting up a vendor and taking it all the way to a payment, I can now log in as multiple users. And what controls do you have access? Controls to actually monitor and audit that somebody's actually logging in as 4 different users to actually perform what should be perfectly good segregation of duties and application controls, which now have been very easily circumvented by just going into the direct database access, running a few SQL statements, and getting all your production application user accounts. So that's a fairly simple procedure. Oracle has actually fixed it by including hashing, so you really can't do this if the hashing is enabled, but very few organizations enable that. So that's the first major way that someone can go through and actually circumvent your application controls and get very easy access across segregation duties and everything like that. A second way that we see a lot of organizations failing is on seeded application database accounts. So when you get an Oracle E-Business Suite environment installed, you're actually getting a number of application accounts, and the database has over 300 accounts. So for the application, there's up to 40 seeded application accounts. And what a seeded application account is one that you need potentially to set up maybe a specific module. So Internet Expenses has a few, CRM has a few. There's a couple out there for each module. The problem is a number of these are active, and a number of those accounts have significant privileges, and almost all of them have default passwords. And typically the password is welcome. There's a few exceptions. I'll show you that in a second. The other major area is that there's database accounts, and there's 300 database accounts installed in a typical Oracle E-Business Suite environment. Almost every single one of those database accounts has significant privileges, enough to basically allow you in the back end to insert records into the vendor table, etc. And almost all of them have default passwords, and almost always the default password equals the username. So there's all these accounts out there that unless you're changing them and being very proactive to change them, they're just popping up. And another issue is when you're doing upgrades or anything, these accounts are also getting created. So if you did an 11i to R12 upgrade, oh, by the way, you got 20 new database accounts and about 6 or 7 new application accounts, all again with default passwords with significant privileges. Unless someone's constantly looking for these, it's very hard to find them unless you know what you're looking for using certain tools. And again, you've got a potential security hole. So what's the impact of using some of these application accounts? Well, if you go through, I've picked out for both an 11i and an R12 environment, these are some of the key seeded application accounts. So almost every Oracle E-Business Suite environment in the world, when you install it, gets these accounts. Here's the account name, here's the password. If you look through the active responsibilities, and these are the key here is active responsibilities. A number of these accounts are either disabled or have inactive responsibilities that have been end dated. These are active responsibilities. So mobile ADM has system administrator. That's a pretty powerful privilege. That's now someone can go in and basically start assigning themselves privileges or do a lot of different other things, such as executing SQL, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. So there's a number of accounts here, and a lot of them have system administrator level privileges or things that are pretty significant. And as you can tell, the passwords aren't very hard to find, and these are actually published out on the internet in a number of places. So these are typically in almost every environment, and unless someone's gone through and carefully changed each of these passwords and disabled the accounts, they're all still there and active and can be basically readily accessed with a couple of clicks. And all probably someone needs to do is just try each one, try the default password. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. No one really checks for one failed login. one of the checks we often put in on different environments is actually listing out all the seeded accounts, and if anyone tries to log in, that basically throws up a red flag, because really these shouldn't be used after go live. So that was the application accounts. Now if we look at the database accounts, this is basically from Intergrigy's security assessments that we do on site for customers. And when we go through, we actually then compile the statistics and put in this into an anonymized database. So this is from about 120 production databases, and these are only the very standard Oracle database accounts. As you can see, sys and system are really, think of, those are the owners of the database. Everyone changes those. The DBAs are very good about changing those. Those exist in every database, but as you can see, the percentage default passwords are very low. Very seldom do we ever find a default password. But the ones highlighted in red, actually outlined in CTX CIS, have significant privileges. Those basically allow you to insert, update, do anything you want with just about any data in the database. So as you can see, we're finding those passwords in 43% of the databases for Outline that we audit. We've actually found that set to the default. And that account can actually go in, and all you have to do is connect to the database, but Outline is the account, Outline is the default password, and basically you have almost DBA privileges. And it's very similar also with CTX CIS. So these basically, now I can go in and update, read, write any data I want in the database. I could probably go in and just insert vendor records at will by just calling the simple Oracle E-Business Suite APIs. That basically I just enter some information with a little bit of knowledge and a couple of Google queries. I could actually pretty easily do that and directly update and insert those vendors in the database. So it's very easy to circumvent the application controls if you can get direct database access, and this is one of the very easy ways to do that. Another problem with the Oracle database passwords is brute forcing. So again, you may have changed all your passwords and you may have done an okay job on doing that. But again, if you've got an apps read account or you're giving direct database access to a number of end users, they can actually go in and potentially read the DBA user table. And what happens a lot of times is that the apps read account has significant read privileges. So it can read in all these password hashes and kind of the passwords the way they're stored. And all you have to do is somehow figure out how to break those passwords. Well, the DBA user table in the database has those passwords, and most often if you just grant typical read privileges to the apps read account or similar query-only accounts, they will have access to the DBA users table. And all you have to do is go Google Oracle Password Cracker. In security parlance, a cracker is a tool that will go break the password hashes. So basically you're getting what you shouldn't be able to read, and it can basically go through and try it. And what brute forcing does is, well, I've got a hash, and the hash should be unbreakable. So it should be just that that's the password stored in there, and I should never be able to get it back. What the cracker does is, well, it just tries millions and millions of times to see if each password matches what that does. And so the crackers are very good now. There's a lot of Russian mathematicians out of work, and what they're doing is writing these very good tools. And there's a competition on how fast you can make these. So people are now doing hundreds of millions of checks a second by using high-end graphics software, high-end graphics cards that are running like gaming machines. And so now if you just basically run one of these crackers, you go in, query the DBA users table, take that output home, and if I have a pretty typical gaming machine at home, so I'm maybe 24 years old, a new guy in AP, you've given me some direct access, but I'm a big gamer, I can actually now get one of these cracker programs, go home, get the password hashes, and actually put it on my machine, let it run for about a week. And if your password is 8 characters or less, I can most likely crack that. And that's pretty significant. You're thinking, well, 8 characters is a pretty damn good password. Well, no, it's not anymore. There's some weaknesses in the Oracle algorithms, and that's actually pretty easy. So now I've actually cracked the apps password potentially for production, and now I can log in as the apps account if your password's 8 or less, or maybe you did a pretty dumb password and it can show up in a dictionary or something like that. And now I can log in right to the database and have significant privileges. So that's actually pretty easy to do. And we have actually seen cases where this has happened. And it's not that far-fetched. So that's kind of about passwords. So two of the key aspects of this is that within the database, those 2 previous issues had to be direct database access. I had to have some sort of access to the database in order to read that information. And many, many Oracle customers allow that sort of database access, that basically an apps read that I can go in and access a lot of data, it's read-only, so people are thinking, well, that's pretty good. I can't write any data, so at least I can just read. Well, besides the sensitive data issue, you can actually read information that will get you pretty far along into getting write access. As you saw, all I needed was an apps read account to go in and basically read the hashes or the encrypted passwords, and I could basically do one more step and get enough information to have full control of the database and the application. One of the problems with a lot of these read-only accounts is there's not much granularity in the privileges. Most people just assign purely, just select any table, select any dictionary system privileges, which allows access to all data. In order to make that more granular and actually exclude certain tables, certain columns on tables, it becomes very difficult, and very few DBAs do that. But if you're actually creating these sort of read accounts or query-only accounts, well, each individual should have one, and then a set of roles should be created limiting access to certain data and also certain columns. So if you're actually looking at the HR, PR, people all table, that has those security numbers in it. Well, you can actually allow access to that, because a lot of people, if you're having to do some read-only query access, well, I need access to all the people, but I don't probably need access to social security numbers, and you can actually set up specific privileges to eliminate that. So when you're actually auditing and looking at how access is done at the database end, ask, are there read-only accounts? Are there generic read-only accounts? How are those set up? Is there any granularity of the database privileges? And most often you'll see is people don't have that level of granularity, which then can lead to other problems, access to sensitive data. Those accounts really should be carefully scrutinized. And also there's typically no control when it's a generic apps read account, as an example. That name is used quite often. And that's passed around. People share it, oh, I need access, can I get the password? So unless you have some auditing or logging, you don't even know who's accessing that account. Another issue that's pretty significant is the use of privileged generic accounts. And going through the questions is when everyone registered for the webinar, about 10% of the people actually asked, how do we control the DBAs? How do we control these privileged accounts? And so within the database, there's app, sys, and system are the key ones. Within the application, there's sysadmin. And the key is that the DBAs have to use these accounts for a lot of maintenance activity. So you have to very carefully balance what the DBAs have to do their job and security and auditing. And then there's also another generic issue that we run into a lot is for scheduling of batch processes. A lot of times people don't want to schedule those batch processes as a single user, because if that person's on vacation or they get terminated or something like that, those processes would then stop running. So that might be a periodically running purge jobs or periodically running import jobs, those type of things. So a lot of times what people do is create a generic application account to actually schedule those jobs. Again, that's a major auditing issue and segregation duties and control, because you don't know who's using those accounts. One of the major issues with Oracle E-Business Suite is there's no auditing on by default. So when you're running Oracle E-Business Suite out of the box, there's really very little auditing. So you really have to spend a lot of time putting in some levels of auditing. And when we're talking about auditing can be a major performance impact. And so most people don't really look at the auditing question correctly. So when we start talking about how to control and monitor the DBAs, well, there's generic accounts and they have to use them, unfortunately. There's no way around that. A lot of people recommend, oh, disable all these accounts. Well, that just doesn't work in the E-Business Suite design. So at the operating system, there's Oracle and Apple Manager. At the database, there's really three key accounts, apps, sys, and system. Very seldom do any of the other accounts have to be used. And at the application, there's sysadmin. I would love to recommend disabling sysadmin, but there's actually a couple occasions when you have to use the sysadmin account. And the sysadmin account always has to be active, because there's some processes that run in the background of the application. So the key is not only you're talking about just database accounts and application, you also have to worry about the operating system account. So you've got generic accounts logging into generic accounts, which becomes very problematic. And so most people say, okay, how do I audit and control the DBAs? Well, you really need to frame that question and say, okay, what do I really want to know? And this is kind of one of the first paths we take down our clients on this discussion is, okay, if you want to control the DBAs, you want to know what they're doing. What do you mean by that in very, very, very big detail? So the key is, do you want to just know that it's the DBAs are doing something and not someone else? So that's really, you trust the DBAs, but I don't really care what they're doing. As long as it's a DBA, I trust them and I know what they're doing. And so that's basically the monitoring the usage of the generic accounts. So I've got a set of named individuals, and I want to just make sure it's one of those, but I'm not really going to get into who did what. That's pretty possible. Just by setting up some generic auditing, there's some third-party products that work well here too. You can actually do that fairly easily. Now the question is becoming, okay, now if I want to go beyond that, I know who the DBAs are. I have a little bit of trust on them, but I need to at least monitor and verify what they're doing. Well, you can monitor the activity by the generic accounts as long as I care if it's only a DBA within the group. I can't really get back to a named account easily. So that's very possible, but it can be costly because now I'm definitely talking about doing some third-party tools. Because the standard auditing within the Oracle database is not protected from the DBAs. You can potentially buy some other tools like Database Audit Vault, but unfortunately you have to actually disable Audit Vault when you're actually applying patches and things. That's not a very good solution. So when we're starting to talk about auditing the DBAs, you're really starting to talk about third-party products because the DBAs have full control over the audit trail in most cases, or they can circumvent it fairly well. The final solution is looking at, I need to know which DBA did what. And that's the most difficult scenario. So I'm basically monitoring activity by an individual person, down to an individual person using a generic account. So I have to somehow get back to, well, this person came in as the apps account and I know it was that person. And that becomes a very difficult, very costly proposition. That's what most people think. Well, I just need to go audit, I need to know what everybody did. Well, you've got people coming in as generic accounts using generic accounts, and unless you've got some very good tools, it's very difficult to go back and actually find what somebody was doing. So it's a very difficult, very costly procedure. We actually did that recently for a customer. It cost them, at the end of the day, with third-party tools and things, about $1 million. So that's a very costly proposition. So when you're starting to think about, I need to control and monitor the DBAs, you really need to think about what you actually want, and that's a very important part of that question. So that's kind of addressing some of the DBAs. I'm not giving lots of detailed answers on that because it's actually a fairly complex issue and it really fits into what your actual requirements are at the end of the day, what you're willing to spend. So the final issue is forms that allow SQL. So we're talking a lot about direct database access here. So not only can I go in as the database, I can potentially compromise accounts, but within the application, there's certain application web pages and forms that actually allow me to execute SQL statements. And all these SQL statements are executed as the owner of the application, or basically the apps account. So the real issue is, can I go into the application and execute a SQL statement somewhere that will then get executed as the apps account? The application really doesn't parse the SQL statements or spend much time figuring out what they're actually doing. So there's a number of cases that I can go into these certain forms and actually then enter any SQL statement I want, and I could potentially, just updating a bank account number is actually trivial. It's just a simple update statement. I can actually input that into one of 30 different forms if I have access to it. So if we look at all the forms that allow access, this is a pretty lengthy list, and if you kind of start looking through here, and if you know some of these form names, well, you might be assigning these out to super users or other people that actually have some low-level administrative functions, and they actually, well, what's the risk of that, defining that one out within my responsibility assignments and things like that. And so this is actually a fairly significant issue because it's kind of hidden. It fits well within your segregation of duties, but until you really think about it, it's easy to grant access to a lot of these different forms. And all I have to do is put a simple update statement in it, run it. It may be an alert, it may be some dynamic triggers or something like that, or even some rules, and that will then get executed. I quickly go back and change the rule back, and since you don't have auditing on that, no one's quite sure actually what was ever executed, and I could just put a simple update statement to change a bank account number. So that's at a fairly high level, talking about some of the general IT controls and kind of how you can circumvent your application controls by just going in and basically doing some bad things on the back end of the database by decrypting passwords, breaking hashes, just entering SQL statements here and there. So now we're kind of go through some conclusions. We're going to start with Jeff.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. So I guess I had a couple things from my perspective on conclusions. Fraud prevention detection requires kind of an overall comprehensive approach, including the following: well-designed processes and controls, That would also include what very well-designed application security. The SQL Forms is a great example of, not designing application security effectively, not having an effective application change management process or application security change management process in place, i.e. you're granting new SQL Forms to a user that should have it, or you don't have any monitoring on those the activities on the SQL Forms, can get you into trouble. And it's not just, P2P security progress, but it's a variety of different, anything. As Stephen mentioned, that, those statements are wide open in terms of what they can do. They can take down the database, they can drop tables, they can do a variety of different things, including inserts, updates, and deletes. So well-designed processes and controls in the front end. I talk about monitoring of sub-material fraud risk. There needs to be specific process and controls related to fraud below the materiality level. Organizations need to have ongoing testing of non-key controls. So oftentimes what we're talking about is controls defined that would not be key from the SOX perspective. And often, organizations don't test those controls on a regular basis, either from a management perspective or maybe don't test them as often from an internal audit perspective. So that's a critical point. Then, Stephen has talked about the known backdoor loopholes. And there's a variety of different ways those can be exploited. So the key conclusion really is vulnerabilities in any of these areas will give a fraudster a foothold that can be exploited, and oftentimes, somebody's intent on committing fraud will find a way to do it. So those are some of my conclusions.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of back to the general IT controls. Really, one of the major issues we see from most clients is that the security part, and also to an extent the compliance, takes really a team effort. The DBAs just don't have time, aren't focused in on security. They're just trying to keep the thing up. That's really what's happening. And then you've got the IT security group who's concerned about security. They want to do a good job, but they have no idea about Oracle E-Business Suite. And then also internal audit, they aren't as versed in the technical side. So until you get a team effort to go through and put some pressure on and say, okay, we need to get this application secured, we need to make sure that no one's doing direct database updates and things like that, it's not going to happen. And so you have to spend a bunch of time going through and bringing these groups together and make sure it happens from a security perspective. Then also, security is constantly changing. It's not a static process. You always have to be reviewing, assessing. Every time you do an upgrade, you may get a new database account that has a default password. Security patches are coming out on a quarterly basis. Talking about security vulnerabilities, typically we see the security vulnerabilities not being patched due to the business. The business has to prioritize the security patches and the upgrades. In order to apply security patches, you have to be on a technology stack upgraded in the last 18 months. So unless you're doing database upgrades and application upgrades on a periodic basis, you're not really getting all the security patches installed on a timely basis. And any one of those security vulnerabilities can be easily exploited and have either full database access or actually do direct updates in the application through SQL injection and other security flaws. And finally, there's really no silver bullet. The Oracle E-Business Suite is a very complex technology stack. You've got a database, application server, application, and until you're really putting in a full suite of different policies and procedures, doing reviews, potentially some tools might be required for auditing, encryption, those types of things, you don't have a secure environment. There's lots of different holes, lots of different places and weaknesses inherent in the application. This application was written in the mid-'80s. It's got a lot of baggage and a lot of issues that you would say, okay, if it's a well-written application, that probably shouldn't exist in 2011. Unfortunately, if you look at the data model of the application, it was written in 1985. So it's a pretty old application before a lot of people were thinking about security and how to actually secure it well. Hopefully a lot of these things are addressed in Fusion, but today it's an old application. It's really starting to show its age from a database model, concurrent manager perspective. It's a nice GUI front end, web enabled, but a lot of the back end, a lot of the processes are still fairly old and not as well secured as they should be. A lot of legacy code in there, a lot of security vulnerabilities we find when we do our audits and have them fixed through Oracle are actually in fairly old code. They're 10 or 15-year-old code, and that's not uncommon. So here's a slide. These slides will be available on both the Intergrigy and ERP Risk Advisors websites. We'll actually send you out an email in the next day or two with the links to the presentation. But here's kind of a few references, either Intergrigy's website. We actually publish out a lot of white papers. Jeff has a couple excellent resources that he maintains 2 Yahoo groups. I don't know if you want to talk about those at all, Jeff.
Yeah, there's just real quickly, the Oracle SOX group is an open group for open membership. The ICRs for end users only, the internal controls repository, where I've shared some files in there that I don't want to get to the world. I actually have just another comment. There's a couple LinkedIn groups that we manage as well. I didn't put on here, but if anybody has questions on any of the groups or any of the resources, sure, feel free to. I think you're just going to show the contact screen next, Steve.
So now we're going to open up for question and answers. We've got a few questions that have come in, and while that is up, I will actually kind of put up both Jeff's and mine contact information. So feel free, we're both very open. Anytime you have any questions, if you have anything kind of auditing, internal controls focused, definitely address it to Jeff. If you ever want to talk about IT security within Oracle, definitely address it to Intergrigy. Jeff and I both publish out a lot of information. We're really proactive about pushing information out because we know this is such a complex environment. A lot of people have questions. A lot of people are new to it. As we went through the registration questions, at least 5 or 6 people said, well, this is our first e-business suite implementation. We have no idea where to go or where to look, especially on the audit information, application controls, and things like that. So we'll open up to some questions here. Now the first question, are bank account numbers encrypted in Oracle? So within the Oracle e-business suite, the only information that is encrypted at this point, and it's an optional encryption, is credit card numbers. Oracle spent a lot of effort doing that, and that is really, as of today, the only information encrypted. That's actually an optional patch that needs to be installed, and you have to go through some rigmarole because when they did it, they actually had to make it so they moved all the credit card numbers from a dozen different tables into a single table. But as of today, there is no encryption of any data, including Social Security numbers, except for Social Security numbers, or except for credit card numbers is the only thing encrypted. Bank account numbers, Social Security numbers, anything else that you would want to be encrypted is not. And it's very, very difficult to do. Most people kind of give up. There are some third-party products that aren't well tested with the e-business suite. That's one route to go. Another option is running Oracle TDE, or another product that encrypts it only at the disk level. So if someone's in the application or the database, they don't see the encryption, but if you lose a tape or a disk drive, it is encrypted. I'll give this one to Jeff. Is Oracle GRC useful in monitoring and controlling EBS access?
Yeah, I would say in general in the Oracle GRC suite, there's a lot of different products within there. It can be effective. It's like any software application. It has its pros and cons. There's several products that compete with it at different price points with different features. So I think it comes down to, as Steve has made the comment earlier, you really have to understand what you're trying to monitor, to understand what technology, what suite of technologies is best to address those issues. And that's, I think what I would encourage you to do is take a holistic approach to understanding what your risks are as a whole, understand what areas you're willing to spend money on to mitigate risk. Steve probably could tell you examples of, organizations say we want to monitor everything that the DBA or the DBAs do, and, he said, well, how much money do you have to spend? Because it can be a never-ending pit. So I think that the critical element of that, of any software analysis, is understanding what you're trying to accomplish. Certainly I've seen Oracle GRC being very effective at monitoring, monitoring certain controls, and the ones we talked about today, the supplier master maintenance and bank accounts, it can be very effective in that.
So here's another question. Should the IT support group be restricted from the accounting processing side of Oracle, i.e. opening and closing accounting periods, posting journal entries, etc.?
I'll take that one, I guess, for me, Steve. That's a great question. Generally speaking, I use the privilege of least, or the concept of least privilege as it relates to security design, and that would mean, the least number of people need to be given access to a particular function as is necessary to perform their jobs, as has proper, supervision and monitoring of what's happening. So, generally speaking, my recommendation is not to give IT access to any transactional forms in a production environment. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations have set precedent and have given business analysts, even some developers, access to transactions. It's a bad idea for a lot of different reasons. In some cases, it allows them to circumvent controls by having the ability to do both transactions and configurations related to transactions. Specifically looking at, opening and closing period, posting journal entries, things like supplier master maintenance, bank account maintenance that are more master data oriented. My recommendation is always to start with not giving access to IT. The question often is then, well, how do they support the application? In most cases, they can do that in a non-production environment. If you've got a reasonably often refreshed production support environment, I would say at least once a week, your production environment needs to be refreshed to a production support instance. If there are issues that are more critical than that, they can work directly with the users using WebEx and GoToMeeting, replicating the issues directly with the users' accounts. Use access to transactions as the ultimate last resort for anybody that's IT oriented. And make sure there's an appropriate approval process before any of that access is given.
Okay, we'll do one final question here. I think we both can take this one. In your combined experience, is procure-to-pay fraud caused more by end users through app layer, or by DBAs, admins, or through backdoors?
I'll throw that one at you first, Steve.
So basically, we have two reference points. The work that we've done personally has been more related to end users, or those people would be on the periphery of Oracle e-business suite, typically like developers or not privileged users. So we've typically seen that happen. And there's also a Secret Service study that was done a number of years ago, and they went through and actually went through a lot of IT fraud and identified who was doing it, and they found out the vast majority of those frauds were performed by people who had lower level job functions, typically like AP clerks and things, and had a very minor IT background. So they might have had some IT in college, they knew how to use a computer, but they basically were self-taught typically. And it was like 50 or 60% of the people in that one study were those type of scenarios. It was very seldom was it ever a privileged DBA or system administrator who was actually executing any sort of fraud, which I was always been thinking was interesting, that it's the people you'd least expect to have the capabilities to do it were the people with the most motivation, because it was typically money oriented. And they just basically learned themselves, did some Google queries, and they were in. And that's kind of been our experience.
Yeah. Now, I'll take a different approach to this. In the sub-material progress article that came out a couple of years ago, I described the current state of most companies is, they're coming to Sarbanes-Oxley with defining a lot of controls, and often those controls are meant to support material fraud risk or material misstatements in the financial statements. And generally, up until maybe a year or two ago, most organizations didn't do any testing of non-key controls or controls that weren't specifically for SOX, because they were just so focused on SOX. So in a lot of respects, for a savvy end user or a savvy IT user that understands both the technology and the business process, they knew the dark alleys. So they would know what's not being tested, and they would know the vulnerabilities that aren't being, especially if they're IT savvy, would know the vulnerabilities that aren't being monitored on a regular basis. So I think in terms of vulnerabilities, I think there's actually more vulnerability because of SOX in some respects than there was prior to SOX, when it wasn't as known as, for example, what types of processes or controls were going to be tested. on a regular basis. Now, having said that, I know that a lot of organizations have started testing fraud risk and non-key controls, and probably a lot of you that are on this call today are here because you're trying to understand what you should be looking at. So that's one comment. The other thing I would say is from a fraud risk perspective, depending upon the technology or technologies you're using, often you can monitor most all the users or most all it goes back to the technology you're using. There's pros and cons of technologies. Certain technologies are kind of, audit-proof, if you will. So others have, like if you're using triggers and somebody has access to the database, you can turn triggers off. So there's always hurdles to put up in this, but you could effectively put up a lot of hurdles to catch most of the issues, using one or two technologies very precisely. So I would say the cost of compliance, if you will, or cost of putting some good monitoring controls in place, you don't have to. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. You can start small and then work your way up into. You should be starting with bank accounts and suppliers tables in the context of this discussion, using either trigger or log-based solution. And there's a variety of different types of log products out there, but generally you can mitigate a lot of risk. You can mitigate a lot of sloppy controls by having some basic controls in place in some areas. As Stephen mentioned, there's a variety of different ways to circumvent those things, but you're dealing with more sophisticated users as opposed to typical users that know the business process and know how to the dark alley, so to speak.
I think that's it for time. We're a little bit over, so I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Jeff, also. This, I think, was hopefully informative for everyone.
Yeah, and I would just encourage everybody to, with the contact information, to contact either one of us with follow-up questions. As Stephen mentioned, we'll send out the slides. We'll make the presentation available for review and follow-up, and use us both as resources to the extent that we can help you, further strengthen your control and security.
Again, thank you so much, and hopefully you will attend another webinar in the future. Have a great day, everyone.